I'm going to rate my favorite episode from each season of The Office. I was someone who found The Office on Netflix as a 15-year-old before it moved to Peacock. My older siblings all loved The Office and watched it weekly when it was still releasing, but I was still a young kid then and I didn't really get it. When I finally found it and decided to watch it for myself, I fell in love with the show, and I can't think of how many times I've watched it all the way through. I stopped counting my watch-throughs when I got to 6 or 7. During the 2020 lockdowns, I even got my dad into the show, and now he watches it too. For most of the show, it is about just your average office workers trying to work around their eccentric boss, and the comedy doesn't come from the characters telling jokes directly to the audience. It comes from the painful real-life scenarios that are exaggerated towards the later seasons. It becomes refreshing when so much of TV is trying so hard to make you laugh, contrasted to The Office that is just presenting you with this random office in the Northeast that has some interesting people working there. All that being said, here are my favorite episodes from every season, rated in order of good to best. Make sure you watch the whole thing and then comment your favorite episode of The Office so we can talk about it down there in the comment section. Season 8 is famously the worst season of The Office, and this episode I would say is the worst of my favorites. I'm someone who watched every episode anytime I rewatch, so I have seen Season 8 just as much as I've seen the rest of the show. And with that, I would say Mrs. California is the best at The Office style in the whole season. Mrs. California is just plainly an episode of The Office, and that is more than a lot of the episodes in Season 8 can say. Ed Helms as Andy is very likable and understandable in this episode. It feels like he is really the regional manager. The only other episode in the whole season that I can think of that does this well is The Incentive, which I almost made my favorite of the season. Where this one is better than The Incentive is that it stays in the office for the whole episode and doesn't really rely on any weird or large gimmicks for laughs. In The Incentive, the gimmick is Andy gets a tattoo, and then we follow the gang to the tattoo shop, and that isn't inherently bad because a lot of episodes on this list leave the office. But in a season that doesn't really feel grounded with the rest of the show, an episode that is just simply a realistic scenario and stays in the setting of The Office makes it take the best episode of the whole season. Robert California also seems like a real person in this episode, even though it was quite the strange request of Robert to Andy to introduce his lovely wife to the whole office, say she was looking for a job, but then to tell Andy not to give her one. James Spader plays the role like he's an actual out-of-touch and hard-to-read executive, instead of the caricature of that role that was written in most of Season 8.
I'm the Lizard King.
Maura Tierney, who played Robert California's wife, did a great job at playing just the pleasant, real person who also has to deal with Robert. John Krasinski's role in this episode as Jim was also quite amusing, with him running away from Robert's questioning. This smaller-scaled episode takes the place of Best Episode in Season 8 simply because it feels like an episode of The Office. I give Mrs. California 8 of Andy's slacks with the little anchor pattern on them out of 10. Season 1 of The Office is the shortest season, so there's not a lot to choose from. I have talked to a few people who tried to start watching The Office when it was on Netflix, but couldn't make it through the first episode. And honestly, I get it. The first episode is just the exact script of the first episode of the original BBC series, and the comedy is definitely off-putting for a lot of people. At the same time, Season 1 has some of the most iconic episodes people mention when talking about the series. A lot of people's favorite episode in Season 1 is Diversity Day, which is a great episode, but in my rewatches, I always end up enjoying Basketball the most in Season 1. Basketball is about the salesman from The Office playing basketball against the warehouse workers. I think the comedy of Diversity Day might be better than Basketball. Actually, it definitely is better. But for me, it's not as enjoyable of a watch. Diversity Day gets very, very uncomfortable. And that is one of the main forms of comedy The Office uses, but in later seasons, the show finds way better ways to utilize that uncomfortableness. And I think Basketball is more representative of the uncomfortableness in the later seasons. In Basketball, we have Michael trying to show off for the warehouse workers, and then we have some good early Jim and Pam moments. Jenna Fischer does a great job here at portraying her feelings for Jim and Roy, as she is cheering for both teams on the sidelines. Dwight's nose guard and anime shirts are hilarious. A lot of great physical comedy from the actual basketball game, and then a lot of good tension building between Jim and Roy. Michael screaming, will never not be funny. And I think everybody has played some sort of sport with someone like that at one point or another. Not much story moving happens in this episode, and that is okay. It's just simple fun and slightly uncomfortable comedy. The rest of season 1 is also very simple, and I think basketball just does it the best. I give basketball 8.5 Dwight's nose guards out of 10. You might be surprised that the finale is this low, but also remember that this is still one of my favorite episodes. For people who have watched the entirety of The Office, this finale is such a great send-off for the series. Really, the last 3 episodes work great together to tie up any loose ends and end up making a nice looking bow. The reason it's so low is yes, it's a great emotional send-off, but the comedy is not at the forefront of the episode. Believe me though, this is not a bad thing. I think the finale of a beloved show is supposed to be sappy. You have the rivals of Dwight and Jim come together as Dwight's bestest mensch, the return of Michael, Erin reuniting with her parents, Creed singing a song, Andy's monologue about the good old days, Pam's monologue about beauty in the mundane.
There's a lot of beauty in ordinary things. Isn't that kind of the point?
There are many more sentimental moments in this episode that I can't name them all. This isn't higher on the list because the other emotional episodes of the series stay more in the lane of the show with the comedy aspects, instead of going so hard into the emotional side. At the end of the day though, this is a great finale, and I look forward to it every rewatch. I give the finale 9 shallow Schrute graves out of 10. This is another emotional episode that is great fan service for people invested in the Pam and Jim storyline. Anytime I reach this part of the series in the rewatch, I find myself smiling like an idiot. The comedy in this episode is also on par with the emotional highs. Andy getting very injured during his attempt at the splits. Kevin's shoes and toupee, Michael not booking a room, Michael's not toast, Jim saying Pam is pregnant, and then Michael trying to save it. All such good iconic moments. And then the emotional highs of the actual ceremony when Jim and Pam run away and get on the boat, and then the whole gang dancing down the aisle. And the first part of Jim's speech before he spills the fact that Pam is pregnant, all great moments that make it the best episode of season 6. This episode is just a great culmination of Jim and Pam's story arc through the whole show, and really pays everything off in a satisfying way. In rewatching this episode for this video, I'm also currently watching Gilmore Girls with my wife, and it is a great reminder that it pays off for a show to give the fans what they actually want, instead of just toying with them like Gilmore Girl does with Lorelai and Luke. If you want to hear me talk about Gilmore Girls, trust me, once I finish watching it, I will be making a video about it. This is one of the most rewarding episodes of TV I have ever watched, only beat by the next episode on this list. So I give Niagara 9.5 mental pictures of Pam blinking out of 10. Goodbye Michael does the balance of emotional goodbye and comedy really well. The first time I watched it, I was a little off-put by how much of the old Michael was in this episode, but I get why they did it after rewatching all of these emotional episodes. Even though this is an emotional episode, with moments like Jim crying, saying goodbye to Michael, and Pam finding Michael at the airport, it still feels like a simple Office episode. I think it was a great choice to make Michael mislead the Office, telling them that he is leaving the next day, because then it limited the emotional goodbyes to just Pam and Jim. Everybody else was still under the impression that he had one more day, so they treated Michael as such, to keep the episode feeling like a normal episode. The return of the party planning committee was also great to see back and caused for some great moments. Through season 7, Michael and Dwight's relationship is shaky, and this episode really brings them together in a great way with the paintball fight. This episode is full of great moments, and is again a great episode for fans, but also manages to be very, very funny still. In the same way, a lot of older episodes are funny, with The Office simply just reacting to Michael. It does the best job of any of these story-driven emotional episodes in the whole series, so I give it 10 unfinished knitted oven mitts from Phyllis out of 10. If you notice, this episode is a 10 out of 10, so what about the rest of the episodes in my list? They are just in order of personal preference from this point, so make sure you keep watching to see exactly where each one is placed. I hope no one is surprised about this placement, as it has become one of the most iconic episodes of the series. This cold open is one of the funniest things I have ever seen on TV.
Have you ever seen a burn victim?
The fire drill is so in character for Dwight, and it's extremely funny seeing the whole office react to the situation. Even though it seems a little over the top, if this was an actual situation, I think people would really be reacting this way, especially with your boss yelling,
Okay, we're trapped, everyone for himself! Okay, let's go! Let's go! Get out of the...
The rest of the episode is just as iconic as the cold open. Multiple iconic moments in the show, like Michael, Dwight, David Wallace, and the other executive talking in New York, the CPR training, and Michael trying to calm down the office, are all from this one episode. This episode mostly takes place within the office, which I always like. The story, even though is over the top, you can buy that it was taking place in a real life office because of the reactions from David Wallace, Stanley when he comes back from the hospital, and of course, Jim and Pam always ground the story. Leslie David Baker does a great performance here as Stanley. I love it anytime Stanley is a greater part of the story, and here, Baker really gets to shine in the role. Pretty much everybody in the cast gets to shine in this episode as well. The writers did a great job incorporating the whole ensemble into the story, making sure every character was utilized. The CPR training scene is absolutely hilarious when the whole group starts breaking out into staying alive, and the actress who portrayed the CPR trainer did a great job in this role, really selling her annoyance with The Office. It really is crazy how many iconic scenes are in Stress Relief, and every time I rewatch it, I forget how much happens here. I give Stress Relief 10 cutout CPR dummy faces out of 10. Dinner Party is one of the most iconic episodes of The Office for good reason. It is peak uncomfortableness in the show. I think the only episode that is harder to watch than Dinner Party is Scott's Tots.
Hey, Mr. Scott, what you gonna do? What you gonna do to make our dreams come true? Hey, Mr. Scott.
Dinner Party manages the cringe and comedy line much better than Scott's Tots does, however, which is what gets its spot on the list. Dinner Party follows Jim, Pam, Andy, Angela, and later, Dwight and his former babysitter to a dinner party at Michael's condo. Michael was able to trick Jim and Pam into coming by creating a fake work assignment, and his plan actually worked.
There. I think you did. I think we should celebrate. How about you, Pam, me, Casa, little dinner, dancing, drinks? You said you didn't have plans. That's what you said.
This episode serves as the end to Michael and Jan's romantic relationship, and I think it does that really well. I am personally more of a fan of the comedy from Jan before she goes completely bonkers, but the writers did a good job here, and again, Melora Hardin does a great job with the character. So many more moments are terribly difficult to watch, but extremely funny. The snip-snap argument is one of my favorite scenes in the entire series.
Snip, snap, snip, snap, snip, snap. You've no idea the physical toll the 3 vasectomies have on a person.
Jim and Pam's reaction to everything is really realistic. That even if the specific scenario hasn't happened to you, you can fully feel how Pam and Jim are feeling. The imagery of Jan, dressed in all red, and all of her candles surrounding the condo, representing the hell she has created for Michael, is probably the best set and costume design in the whole show. This is an episode that I could spend a whole video talking about. There are just so many great moments in this episode. I give Dinner Party 10 reversed vasectomies out of 10. When a lot of people talk about their favorite episodes of Season 2, they talk about Casino Night. The reason why I didn't go with Casino Night is because so many of the episodes I mentioned are big, emotional, story-filled episodes, and I wanted some more representation of the smaller scaled episodes. I think that this is really when the series is at its best anyways. I love Casino Night, and maybe I'll make another video where I talk about it more at length, but for now I'll get back to The Client. The Client is one of my favorites in my rewatch because the early Michael and Jan dynamic is so great. Seeing Melora Hardin as Jan's tired reactions to Michael before her unraveling later in the series is hilarious.
Excuse me, can I have a vodka tonic, please?
Seeing Michael's sales tactics with the Lackawanna County guy, played by Tim Meadows, is a good addition as well, because we see why Michael is where he is in his career. In the Halloween episode, we see a more human side of him at the very end of the episode, and in The Client, we see his sales skills. Season 2 put a lot of work into making Michael likable, and that work is very noticeable here in this episode. I mentioned Tim Meadows earlier, and he does a great performance here. Him laughing with Michael was a great way to capture the viewer, because we're so used to Michael being laughed at, not laughed with. This is also the episode with the first hint at a romance between Michael and Jan, and the first time we hear of Michael's screenplay, Threat Level Midnight. Even though this is a much smaller scale episode than Casino Night, this episode has a lot of great story-moving moments with Michael and Jan and Jim and Pam. With Jim and Pam leading the charge of reading Threat Level Midnight and the rooftop dinner, and then Jim calling it a date, being pretty upfront with Pam. Then Michael and Jan kissing after they made the sale, and Jan accusing Michael of getting her drunk when she calls him the next day. The client is solid and simple. It manages to move the story forward without being a huge episode, and is very funny and entertaining. The client gets 10 baby back rib jingles out of 10. In my consideration for my favorite episode from each season, I knew that season 3 was my favorite season, but I wasn't sure if that meant that Grief Counseling would be my favorite episode of the whole series. Because Grief Counseling is such a simple episode on the surface, I was pretty sure I wouldn't end up putting it at number 1. But after watching all of these episodes again, I think it is my favorite episode of the whole show. Grief Counseling is such a simple episode, which I think you've probably noticed that those are my preferred episodes. The story of Michael's former boss dying and him not knowing how to deal with it is very endearing to watch. The writers were able to show the unawareness Michael has about his own self.
Death's just a part of life. I mean, just this morning I saw a little bird fly into the glass doors downstairs and die. And I had to keep going.
How do you know
What?
that bird was dead? Did you check its breathing?
It was obvious.
Was its heart beating? Toby, did you check it? No, of course you didn't. You're not a veterinarian. You don't know anything! Michael?
And they use Pam as the older sister figure, helping him to figure out how he's feeling through the outlet of the bird funeral. Steve Carell's performance is great here. Not only is he extremely funny in this episode, but you can tell that Carell cared about the character of Michael Scott and put a lot of thought into the performance in this episode. The concept of grief is a hard one to tackle, especially in a comedy show, and this episode did such a great job at showcasing grief and how it can affect people, even when they don't realize it's affecting them.
Thing is good grief. Ask Charlie Brown.
The B story in this episode is with Jim and Karen in Stamford, and that was one thing that caused me to be a little hesitant about making this my number 1 episode. Having Jim and Pam in the office together is such a staple of the show, but to be honest, this episode didn't need it. Pam was great in this episode without Jim.
When I found out that she asked her manager to remove her breathing tube so she could die.
And Jim and Karen's story was cute enough, even with knowing where their relationship ends up at the end of the season. The bird funeral at the end of the episode is such a great moment for the show, and when Pam asks to say a few words and read the eulogy, Michael's reaction is so great and such a great ending to the episode. The final tag of the episode with Dwight spraying the box with the fire extinguisher is a great final joke thrown in there, and is a good representation of the rest of the episode with the contrast of emotions and comedy. Grief Counseling tackles hard themes, but does it in such an effective and funny way. This mundane and simple episode is my favorite episode of the whole series, and of course, it gets 10 bird coffins made out of a tissue box out of 10. Thank you all for sticking around to the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know your favorite episode of The Office in the comments, and we can talk about it. I love reading and replying to all your comments. All right, see you all next time. Bye.